Let's talk about Donald Trump's trade war. Now, I am not an economist, and the chances are pretty high that you're not either. So I understand that this can be a lot to try to make sense of, or even just pay attention to, especially when it sounds like something happening in some faraway exotic land like Canada. But the truth is that Illinois is on the front lines for two of the biggest commodity battles on the Chinese front of this trade war: steel and soybeans.
They'd fire you, and they'd go to other countries, they'd make the product, they'd sell it into our country, tax-free, no tax, don't worry about it. Very soon, these amazing workers will once again be pumping out 2.7 million tons of raw American steel.
Let's talk about steel first, because that's where this all begins. Steel tariffs had been on Trump's agenda since the election. In the 2010s, the steel industry got hit really hard by this perfect economic storm. Things like lowered gas prices caused lower demand for locally produced steel, but some would argue that the biggest issue was cheap imported steel from China. See, China subsidizes their steel production, making the steel cheaper to produce and thus cheaper to sell, but also harder for local companies to compete with. During this time, at one factory in Granite City, Illinois, US Steel laid off 2,000 of their workers. Now, in 2015, the US International Trade Commission agreed that this was unfair, and they slapped duties on imported Chinese steel. Slowly but surely, the steel industry began to recover. But for some people, like Trump, this wasn't enough. He slapped tariffs on Chinese steel. And there's no doubt that it kicked the steel recovery into high gear. The day that Donald Trump announced his steel tariffs, the president of US Steel, who's a friend of the Trump administration, announced a new hiring spree. And now, at that same plant in Granite City, they're almost back up to full capacity. That's actually what brought Trump to Illinois for the first time as a sitting president, so he could tout his trade war as a job-creating success.
US Steel announced it was restarting production right here in Granite City and bringing back far more than the original estimate of 500 jobs.
So if you are one of the roughly 25,000 steelworkers in Illinois, this trade war looks like good news. But if you're one of the 43,000 soybean farmers, well, then this trade war sure looks like something different. Well, the US had been complaining about the subsidies that China was providing for steel production. China has been complaining about the subsidies that we provide for agriculture. So when we slapped those tariffs on Chinese steel, China slapped back with a whole bunch of tariffs on agricultural products. The biggest one being soybeans. And Illinois is the US's #1 soybean producer. Over a quarter of our state's total land is dedicated to growing soybeans. And 60% of those soybeans are exported. The world's #1 importer of soybeans by far is China. Well, it's really difficult to put a number on the effect that this will have on the soybean industry. The Trump administration has made a pretty good guess: $12 billion. That's how much money they've set aside in relief aid for farmers affected by the trade war. Ironically, that's money that is probably going to get added to the national debt, which China holds the most of. So in a sense, we are borrowing the money from China in order to pay off the American soybean workers who are affected by the Chinese tariffs on soybeans. And this is part of a lot of reasons why the soybean industry has largely responded by saying thanks, but really we'd rather have trade. In fact, trade not aid is one of their new slogans. It also sets a problematic precedent. Are we going to be able to bail out every industry that's affected by the trade war? Hog farmers in Illinois are also being massively affected by the trade war, in particular with Mexico. But they're not sure that they're going to get the relief aid that they need to survive. And I can't help but wonder, if we suddenly have $12 billion that we can use for relief aid for soybean farmers, couldn't we have used that money for subsidies, for steel? You know, maybe level the playing field without the uncertainty of a trade war? Now, steel and soy are just two pieces of this massively complex puzzle that is the trade war, which in some way or other is going to affect every industry around the world. So anybody who tries to tell you that they know how this trade war is going to play out is probably trying to sell you a hastily written book. But what I can tell you for certain is that those effects will be felt especially hard here in Illinois, for better or for worse.